Welcome to step-by-step flood planning for apartment residents. This is the second part of our flood planning for apartments webinars. We had an earlier webinar that's been recorded online all about flood planning for apartment buildings 2 weeks ago. So if you haven't watched that, do jump online and have a look at it. Just want to say that our work, Resilient Kurilpa's work, is based around the suburbs of West End, South Brisbane, Highgate Hill and Hilland. And Kurilpa is an Aboriginal word meaning place of the fawn-footed melomys or the kuril, the native water rat, which you may have seen around the riverbanks. They're a little elusive. So I just want to acknowledge this place name and the sovereignty of the Jagera and the Turrbal peoples, their custodianship to country, which includes the beautiful winding Maywa River, and pay respects to elders past and present, as well as any First Nations people joining us tonight. I also just want to quote a story here from the Kurilpa Flood Library from Kalkadu man and Kurilpa resident Uncle Willie Prince. He said, you know, there were Indigenous clans all along the river, and they had different names for parts of the river like Mianjin or Maywa. Other clan groups living further down would name the river again, but Maywa is sort of widely used. And after colonial settlement, the river was named again, of course, after the former Governor of New South Wales, Sir Thomas Brisbane. So just a little bit of history and Indigenous knowledge there. My name is Paula Hardy. I'm a design strategist living in Kurilpa and a PhD candidate at Griffith University in the area of service design and climate adaptation. I represent the West End Community Association within Resilient Kurilpa's network of local residents and representatives from other orgs around the area, which includes Community Plus, which operates the West End Community House and the Yeronga Neighbourhood Centre, Kurilpa Futures, and the West End Traders. So our network formed just after the February 2022 flood with the aim to strengthen flood resilience in our very rapidly growing neighbourhood, and we develop online tools and resources and engage with our community and other floodplain communities to sort of build their own resilience. And tonight we are joined by two people who have been really generous in sharing their knowledge to support these aims. We have Dr Beth O'Brien. Is a Kurilpa local, a disability advocate, public speaker, and the co-founder of Consultable, which is an organisation that works with businesses to remove barriers to inclusive access in order to better meet the needs of people living with disabilities. And while Beth enjoys an independent, active life in Kurilpa, she often faces challenges accessing venues, events, products, and services. Beth was born with a rare form of dwarfism and has used an electric wheelchair since starting school. She has a PhD in social psychology and she's currently working as a director at the Queensland Department of Education, supporting young people's mental health and wellbeing. So welcome, Dr. Beth. We're very glad for you to be joining us tonight. And we're also going to be joined by Leanne Sturgess, who has lived in West End for 16 years. Leanne has shared very valuable lived experience and knowledge from the 2011 and 2022 floods through her work with Resilient Kurilpa. She's a body corporate committee member and has been for 15 years and a chair since 2019. And Leanne's led the drafting and implementation of flood mitigation plans for her residents at Flow Apartments and for neighbouring communities. So Leanne's also committed to empowering and advocating for her community, particularly in the areas of insurance, inclusion and accessibility. So welcome, Leanne. Tonight we're going to explore stories from the Kurilpa Flood Library and we're going to get some insights from Dr Beth O'Brien. That's going to create a little bit of context for us to speak about before we sort of delve into specific steps and tools and procedures that you can implement into your own apartment communities to help prepare residents for floods. And then we'll have about 30 minutes or so of Q&A at the end. At this point, I also just want to acknowledge that floods can be a fairly triggering topic for some people, so please do take a break if you need to. There's also free flood recovery support available from changefutures.org.au and Metro South Health. We'll put the links to those services in the chat shortly. They're just good to have on hand generally in the event of referring any residents in your community in future. And also in preparation for the Q&A, please do submit your questions at any time by selecting the Q&A tab at the top. And I also just encourage you to share any stories or thoughts or tips that you might have as we go along in the chat box. We'll be running a couple of polls or a few polls in the next few minutes to also just get a sense of who's joining us here tonight and how prepared we're all feeling. And so can I actually, just on that, can I ask if you did attend the building webinar 2 weeks ago, not to submit to these polls again, because we just want to avoid a bit of a doubling up of data there. So the first question I want to ask everyone is, what is your role? Are you a body corporate member? Are you a building manager? Are you an apartment resident? We'd love to know that information if you put in your response there. So there's a couple of reasons why we want to focus on apartments and preparing residents. Firstly, apartments make up around 80% of dwellings in Kurilpa, with more on the way. And with the changing climate and the unpredictability of flood disasters, apartment residents face pretty unique challenges for preparing, responding to and recovering from floods. Secondly, we know that thousands of new residents are moving to our neighbourhood each year between floods. Many new residents and homeowners might not have prior knowledge of how floods impact their buildings and their surrounding environment as well. In fact, during the 2022 flood, we know that the majority of residents in the Gabba ward didn't live at their address at the time of the 2011 flood. So between those two floods, we saw around 28 apartment blocks constructed in the flood zone, and approximately 16,000 additional residents had moved to Kurilpa, many of them living on that Coombe swamp west of the Montague Road. So a second question here I want to ask is, if it applies to you, how prepared would you say your apartment complex was for the 2022 floods? If 1 star represents underprepared and 5 stars represents very prepared. We know much of the workload for preparing, responding and recovering from floods is shared, and it's carried by residents, and it has been for many years. You can see in that photo in the top left there from an elderly resident who has lived in Avebury Street since before the 74 floods. And you can see there the cleanup happening. So we know the cooperation and support from residents and local community in all stages of flood is paramount to short-term and also long-term wellbeing. And that ranges, you know, from volunteer cleanup efforts and teamwork to longer-term supports provided by community services such as, you know, mental health providers or neighbourhood centres like the West End Community House. We also know from the data we've collected that there's no universal experience of flood. Residents range from having, you know, positive or novel experiences of flood to quite negative and distressing experiences. So it's just important to remember not everyone has the same capacity, abilities, resources, you know, knowledge, and also support networks needed to bounce back from floods well. And as our neighbourhood population grows, we're also have more and more residents without that prior knowledge and experience of floods. So communication and the transfer of flood knowledge is really key. And that's really what Resilient Kurilpa's main aim is to share local knowledge about what it's like to live with flood risk and support our community to take steps to prepare and mitigate flood impacts. One of the tools that we have on our website is the Kurilpa Flood Library that you can see here. It holds over 170 cards, some of which show sort of local flood stories and observations. And the cards capture some experiences that we saw in Kurilpa. And it's just a good resource to sort of share with residents, particularly new residents who might be new to the area. So some of these stories we've collected has been from one local resident who lived in a unit complex who lost power and had to evacuate because he needed to keep his medication cold and charge his wheelchair. And, you know, he as he called for support, his mobile phone quickly ran out of battery. You know, the 2 council evacuation centres were beyond his reach because the roads were flooded. So a nearby support worker helped him move to a hotel, which flooded shortly after, meaning that he had to evacuate a second time. So individual emergency planning is so important for people, not just with disability or chronic health conditions, but people who are going to be affected by power outages and flooded streets. You know, these are major barriers for people who rely on power for communication, medical treatment and equipment, or require access to their support networks or support workers and medical services. And that emergency planning is undertaken in collaboration and communication with an individual's support networks, which includes people within the wider apartment building. A couple other stories. In the 2022 flood, the council's mud army was missing for many days. So it was really the locals who helped with the cleanup. You know, anyone who's lived through a flood here can attest to that. We saw services at the West End Community House going into full swing, offering vouchers and assistance payments, information, emergency relief. We saw the local elected reps working on issues sort of at the interface between council and Energex and state government and community. Another story is offered by our communities, or one of our community's most experienced floodies, called Anne, who described how the 74 floodwaters entered into her garage as everyone sort of desperately relocated their things, and they jammed cars at the top of the street, as you can see from this aerial shot of Avebury Street from the Queensland State Archives. But Anne says this wasn't such a desperate flood for her, as they'd only been living there for about 2 years and they hadn't had much time to accumulate many belongings in their storage. So there's sort of a lesson in there for apartment dwellers with storage cages in their basement. So on our website, you will find locally developed resources in our apartment toolkit, including an updated flood mitigation plan template. If you've followed Resilient Kurilpa for, you know, the last couple of years, you may have seen our old template. We've updated it now. We've made it a bit more accessible, a bit more readable. And developing a plan like this for your apartment building and your residents will allow you to keep a record of flood impacts, you know, procedures, mitigation strategies that can be updated, reviewed, and most importantly, shared with future residents and owners so that they're not lost. I want to ask the last poll question at this point, which is where are you in your flood planning journey? If you haven't answered this question before, please give us an idea of where you are. You know, have you done comprehensive flood mitigation planning and works in your apartment building? Are you still working on it? Are you thinking and talking about it, or have you not begun at all? So we know that flood mitigation planning is a big undertaking for volunteer body corporate committees and other roles. So on our apartment toolkit, you'll find the plan's appendix items available as separate templates, which you can download and edit. And these include things like duty cards and checklists and resident communication materials. And that just allows you to sort of take smaller steps, incremental steps, and developing things up for your apartment residents that may build up into a more comprehensive flood mitigation plan. Leanne's going to be going through key sections of that plan and some of these templates shortly as well. You'll also find guidance to help you develop your own plan, including an example from the River Point apartments here too. Lastly, you can join our Apartments Network Facebook group to post questions and share insights with other apartment dwellers and body corporates. We know that the flood mitigation journey is not a simple one, but it is a shared one. So please do tap into that community network so that we can help each other adapt. Dr. Beth, I'm going to hand over to you now. Dr. Beth's going to share some really valuable insights. So yes, please take it away. I'll just pull the slides down.
Thanks, Paula. Thanks very much for inviting me along. So like Paula said, some of you might have seen me around West End. I've lived here for most of my adult life, and I use a wheelchair full time to get around. And so I'm not really here today to speak about any technical elements of flood preparation. I'm not knowledgeable like Paula and Leanne on that front, but more to just give some insight into my experiences of living in West End for the 2011 and 22 floods. And I guess have a think about what, if you are someone like me who might need some help during a flood, what I've learned are some things that are helpful to think about in advance and what helped me at the time. But also if you're someone who doesn't need any help, I guess to get you thinking about if you'd be willing to help someone during a flood, what you might be able to help them with during that time. So in the 2011 flood, I lived in an apartment block and we were told to leave. So in that flood, I got out before the roads closed and I was picked up by some family, and I went and lived in a family house for a couple of weeks while the waters went down. And although, you know, there were good things about that in that I wasn't here, I wasn't stuck. It's also one of the things about using a wheelchair or living with disability. And I guess I should preface this by saying whenever I talk about experiences, I just want to recognize that disability and chronic health issues are really diverse. So what's relevant to me might not be relevant to someone else with disability. But I think that the process that we all have to go through in terms of forward thinking and the extra challenges that we face are usually quite universal to people with disability. But just acknowledging that this is really my experience as someone who uses a wheelchair. So even though it was good to get out for the 2011 floods, often your home as someone with a disability is the only place in your community that's really set up for you for the way that you need to live day to day. So it can actually be quite hard to be taken out of that environment and staying, even if it's with family. Often you might visit that house, but it's not somewhere you're used to living. So it was quite challenging in that respect. And I was very glad to get home at the end. But in 22, it was quite different because we weren't told to leave. And at the time, I didn't really have a good option of somewhere else to go to anyway. So I decided, and I was living on my own at that stage, and I decided to stay where I was, knowing that living on the 6th floor, I was going to pretty much be stuck in my apartment for the duration of time until the flood waters receded. And, you know, like Paula says, there's a lot of things to think about when you know that you're not going to have access to lifts or electricity at all. So I had to think about how long my wheelchair was going to last with power before it ran out. And obviously when you're confined to a small apartment, you don't use up as much energy. So I was very lucky that it was only on the last battery life the day before the electricity came back on. So I didn't actually get stuck completely. But if my wheelchair had run out of battery, that would have been a completely another issue that I would have had to think about. And living on the 6th floor, I would not have been able to get down, and my wheelchair is very heavy. So it would have been quite difficult to overcome that issue. So I guess there were a lot of things for me to think about during that time. And I was very lucky that I formed a lot of really good relationships with people in my building, but also in the wider complex and in wider West End. So I had people traipsing up and down the 6 flights of stairs every day, bringing me ice, bringing me food so that I could keep some food cold, taking my phone and my devices and charging them, bringing me camp lights and checking in on me all of the time, so that because to be honest, even as a grown adult, I was quite scared at night in particular. And I thought, well, if my phone runs out of battery and I need something, I felt like I was really stuck. So I think without that support network and the very generous help that I got from a lot of people around me, it really wouldn't have been doable, because like Paula said, we're also relying on communication, and communication is the way that you're going to be able to keep safe. So I think if I hadn't had that generosity of the people around me, I wouldn't have been able to stay here for that amount of time. So I guess now there was a lot of things I learned from staying in 22 that I now haven't put into place, but I should put into place. So I think that, what Leanne talks about in terms of preparation, I need to definitely listen closely to that and think about all of the things that I should put in place for next time. But I think it's also that really important element of just the community. And I think we're lucky in West End that we have a really strong community anyway. But there are also people on my floor now I know who also might need help. And even though I wouldn't be able to help them in a way that someone who wasn't disabled would be able to help them by going downstairs and getting things, if they were also on my level and we decided to stay, I could help those people with company. I could help them with, cooking, or if they were elderly, that kind of thing. So I think as well, it's about what could I do now to know that I could help other people on my floor if they needed help as well. And I think one of the things, Paula spoke to it a little bit in the introduction, is that acknowledgement that we all have different capacity in the way that we can provide help in times of crisis like floods. And I actually felt very guilty because I knew that everybody downstairs was doing all of the really, really hard labor. Luckily, I didn't have a storage compartment that someone had to clean out for me. So that was one good thing. But I actually, as someone who often is the person who helps people in their life out rather than gets help, I felt quite guilty. And I think that that's something to think about if you are someone who's needing some help and getting stuck, just to remind yourself that, there are situations in which we can't really control the fact that we can't help. But maybe there are other ways, like I said, if there's someone else on the floor that you might be able to help, that might be some way to ease some of that guilt. So I think that in future, what I'm going to do is have a bit of a flood pack in my apartment. I just got to find some space for it within all of my books and clothes and plants. But I think that what I wish I had was things to charge my phone, those battery packs, multiple of those that, maybe I charge them every weekend, for example. I wish that I'd had some of those camping lights that last for hours that people very generously lent me during that time. And I think that having a written down plan that maybe I give to a few people who I know in the building might be helpful as well, just so that if my phone was to be dead, they might know what they might need to help me out with, even without me being able to contact them. But I do think that decision around whether you stay or you go is quite a difficult one, because for the 2022, I ended up being glad that I stayed, because it meant that I could continue to be relatively independent with all the help I had in my own place, rather than going to stay somewhere where I really wouldn't have been able to easily do everything that I need to do for myself every day. But if it had gone on any longer and the electricity had been out for longer, because I think having electricity in your apartment and not being able to go downstairs is very different from being in your apartment and not having electricity. For me, I could be stuck up here for 2 months if I had to, because I'm very fortunate to be able to work from home. But without electricity, it's really not that easy. So yeah, I think without the people around me to support me, it would have been a very bad decision. Or had the electricity stayed out for a lot longer, that also would have made it really difficult. But I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has in the Q&A component. But I think that, if there's someone that you know around who you think might need help in those situations, you know, maybe just touch base with them one day and say, hey, if there was a flood, is there something I could do to help? And I know that I'm going to do that with someone on my floor who I think I might be able to help if she was left here upstairs as well. And I think for me, I need to make sure that I really tell people in advance what I need so that I don't get stuck in a situation that's really dangerous. Thanks, Paula.
Thanks, Beth. I love your honesty in where you are at with your flood planning. Like, I think that's why we asked that question, you know, in the poll. We recognize that everyone's at really different stages of their flood planning, whether it's individual personal emergency planning or, you know, that bigger job of organizing all your apartment residents and implementing mitigation works in your building. So yeah, appreciate the candor. We're going to hand over to Leanne now. Just reshare these slides. One moment. All right. Thanks, Leanne.
Thank you. Thank you, Paula. And I'd just like to say thank you to Beth as well. That was really, thank you for being so raw and honest. It's probably not as easy as it seems to just tell people your story sometimes. So that's really good. Thanks for the introduction, Paula. That was great. That took that off my list to do. And I just wanted to also say thank you to the attendees tonight and hopefully the people in the future who are watching this, because if you've made the time to watch this and be involved, then you are someone who will be making a change for your community in the next time we have an event, and we will all be better prepared and we will all be more resilient. So thanks to everybody, actually. It's a great opportunity. So the slides, I'm hoping, okay, I just clicked down here. So obviously I'm going to be sharing tonight the River Point apartment plan, so that the template obviously is the generic version. Hopefully using this plan, you'll see how we've implemented what specifically is for our building. Obviously, if you watched the previous webinar with Adrian, this is where River Point sits. I think I'm supposed to do this so that you can see on here that my cursor is moving around. So we're right on the river, and quite a big complex, 9 buildings, and 3,000 square meters in our basement, all interconnected. I think doing a plan for basically it's got to come from the community, but more so that's led through from the body corporate committee. It's a very overwhelming document, but it's very overwhelming to start the process. Why do we need to have a plan? This is why we need to prepare. Seeing people's belongings and possessions in a heap on the road outside your apartments is very confronting, and we really don't need to have this. With proper preparation and our best laid plans, of course, I think we could, well, I know we can definitely avoid scenes like this. The flood will happen, but we can absolutely mitigate the effects it has on us, and personally, on our community, and on our belongings. So the key points of the document that I will be sort of getting through tonight, I'm very conscious that I've got a lot of slides, and I've worked out, I think I've got a minute per slide. So I don't want to rush, but I also don't want to miss out on some things at the end for you. I'm just going to go through some really key points in the document. Obviously, that's very obvious for what's been highlighted there, so bear with me. Roles and responsibilities. This is it was a very unknown thing, I think, along through some communities, because we come into living in an apartment for various reasons, but usually that's because we're very confident that we have a home to live in, that someone else will also assist us, whether that be for security, whether that's for, you can lock up and leave to go for periods of time without worrying about your security or your home being vulnerable if it's just a standalone. So but we think that there's other people that also will look after these things for us. And those people are also people in the community. They're also residents, owners, and we're made up by your body corporate committee. So the committee is who actually leads and takes control here. So I think what we just need to understand is that it's not some group of people. It's not your body corporate managers, your strata managers. They manage your administration. It is not necessarily, it involves your building manager, but it is not your building manager's responsibility, because a lot of times there's a lot of them that don't have an on-site manager. It may be a company that manages several sites, so they would be trying to help several sites. The most important people are your body corporate committee, and they are volunteers who represent the owners. It's part of their duties and their role to be able to start this process and also then guide and lead through, and they will guide your community through an event. And if people are willing to participate and go and be part of that process, your efficacy will be of your outcome, how you move through the event will have a much better outcome. So it's about being all in together. So in River Point, we've recognised being such a big site with 9 buildings, a big area, there's very separate areas that need people's, focus. It's very difficult to have one person controlling everything. So in River Point, we've got a flood response group, and that's Adrian's group, the technical team, those engineers, those people who are going to monitor and watch triggers, and they're also working towards making sure that the building in those things like pumps and electrical and things are covered and prepared and ready. In a small complex, it may be the same people, or you may just have to get your building manager will help with that because they know those things intimately as well. A really important person is a communications person, someone who's tasked with just communicating the messages that you need to get out to everybody and keeping everybody informed. So rather than that person being involved in multiple roles, they just need to make sure that they're communicating the needs of, the directions and the decisions that are being made at different points along the time frame of your preparation, during, keeping people informed and what's happening, and also after, so that everybody's understanding. And if people understand what's happening around them, there's a lot calmer atmosphere. They don't panic, they don't get angry if they understand clearly what's happening and that someone has control. So this is really important, to have someone dedicated to getting the information out in a timely manner, and it's all on the same page. We decided that we needed a site coordinator to be directing and guiding people, so we didn't have people sort of, again, a big site, 9 buildings, 330 apartments. There's a lot of moving parts. And in that, we've talked about having a building warden, or we have building wardens, 1 per building, possibly a backup person as well. If there's only 5 units in one building, but other buildings, 14 units, but some may have, 30, 35 apartments in that building. So you might need 2 people to help get that section prepared. And then you've got volunteers and, whether that be outside volunteers, family and friends of the resident, but also the residents. So it's all about coming together and following this path of how we're going to coordinate to make sure that it's, running smoothly and that everything is done in the correct order. In the plan, we've actually put in duty cards so that you're very clear on what these roles and these positions include. So we've got duty cards for the site coordinator, the admin communications officer, and building wardens. So when you're looking for people, or when you're asking people from your community, your residents, this is a very clear guideline of what will be expected of them. And, you can ensure then that you might get the right person. people are very well-meaning to put their hand up and say, I'm happy to do something, but sometimes they don't realise what is expected of them either. So there's a very clear path that we've set up here to understand, what's their roles and responsibilities of each of those. So that's in the plan, in the templates. And the procedures that we've written. So I just want to take a moment here to let you know that obviously we've written this with the and compiled it with the best intentions. And, these procedures we've written should be followed as to the best possible extent during an event, but they are a guide only. Mother Nature will control the event, but we have a factor of how we mitigate the damage that we incur on our homes and our belongings. So the best thing here is that, look at them, make sure that you adapt them so that they are for your building. There is no point just picking up the plan and all of a sudden you're running around with a list of things to do that actually isn't even relevant to your building. So again, make sure that it is, you've gone through it and, curated things and made sure that it is, applicable for your building. Do you need to have that? You may have no underground parking. You may have one level, you may have two levels, you may have one lift, you may have 15 lifts. There's lots of different things. So you have to think about all of those as to how your procedures will be carried out. Really good to make sure that you test a lot of this before. Have a dry run. So that's really important as well to make sure that it does work. It might be good to put in theory, but practice is always the thing that shows up. The contact lists. I think this is probably the most important piece of a document that I can say it'll be the most challenging, but is probably the most important document that you need to have in your plan and make sure that it is something that it's a difficult one to start. Very easy to get owners' details, contact details. More difficult to get if it's a tenant's details. And look, all the way through, everything I've always talked about is please don't talk about your community as owners and tenants or owners and renters. They're residents in your community. They're all residents, and the due care and diligence is to be there for all the residents. It's not about their ownership or their the way they are there, if they own the unit or not. They are all residents. So we need to make sure that we're communicating and keeping everybody informed. And now the difficult part is that, for tenants that may come and go more frequently than owners, is keeping that list updated. But the building manager absolutely can make sure that is the document that's kept updated. We have come up with a resident contact information form. So whenever people are moving into the building, obviously they have to advise that they're moving in. Lifts need to be protected. They need to know where things are. So the building manager is instrumental in that. So this very basic information sheet for them to fill in is so important. And if you explain this to people, it's not about wanting their personal details. It's about knowing, what unit they're in, what car parks they own, what storage cages they own. And, if you see vehicles down there and they're still not moved, you know who to contact straight away. You're not running around for hours trying to find out who owns this vehicle, whose storage cage is this. And I think the other good thing is making sure that it's that they also have, and in the other rest of the document, you'll see that they also ask about an emergency contact. That's so important to make sure that you as a resident has an emergency contact, that if you are away overseas or you're away because if it's interstate, whatever it is, you can't get back to the apartment at that time or your home at that time, that there's someone else that can be contacted if you aren't able to be contacted. So they can then come and take care of your things, if take a car away for you, or you've got contacts there that will that they will turn up and help, or at least be able to pass on information to you to make a decision. Talking about the communication plan, really important, I think, that people didn't understand is that you need to use the 5-panel public address system and how to use it. That's the first, because obviously people are in here and that information will be broadcast into their apartments and into the whole building. You then need to take the next step down is for who's not here. And then that's what I was talking about, the communications officer, making sure you're communicating it via various methods. Don't just choose, oh, we've put it on the Facebook page. Not everybody is on Facebook. Not everybody's on social media. You know, if you need emails, they may be checking emails. Don't assume that they've checked their emails. They might not have their laptop with them or a phone that is accepting them. You know, it's a variety of, you know, text messages, call them, all those avenues. So important not just to choose one level of communication. Really importantly, make sure you understand if you have a complex that has multiple buildings, as in River Point, they were making announcements. Unfortunately, it wasn't on every fire panel. They didn't realise that there were 5 separate fire panels to make the announcement. So some would get there, one building or a couple of buildings were getting it through that fire panel, but the rest of the buildings weren't hearing it because the messages weren't being relayed. So again, if you're relaying a message, make sure if you've got, you know, more than one fire panel, that those building wardens or that those people then relay the same message throughout the other fire panels, and knowing how to use them to make sure. They will also only have about 2 days, I think 2 days of battery backup. So if your power's going to be off for a couple more days, you know, you've got to think about how we're going to use that communication system. We had a generator on site at Flow, so we could get our fire panel back up and operational with power to continue to use it. But really important in your preparation phase, making sure the messages are getting out on site. Your safety plan obviously is really important. You know, thinking about your residents is your highest priority. I think, you know, evacuating is a decision obviously that will be made by, you know, Queensland Emergency Services, and some people will say, but I don't want to leave. If Queensland Emergency Services are coming down the road and telling us to move, it's really not negotiable, because they know that there's going to be a point where then you can't leave, but then the services within your building may no longer operate. And that's like things like your sewage systems. If you've got 20 floors and you've got people flushing toilets from the top floor and your groundwater level is rising, there is nowhere for that to go. So you can't be living in that. So it's whilst you think, well, I'm okay, I'm on the 5th floor, 10th floor, I'm not flooded, I can live here, I'm okay. It's about, you know, living within the building, you know, that's important. So it's not just about sometimes your decision. You have to understand you probably will have that decision made for you if it gets to that point. And obviously residents following reasonable instructions given by, you know, the teams, because they're doing it for the overall safety. This page with the triggers and evacuation, this is obviously what Adrian talked about, and, you know, having to know how that will affect your building and your level of time beforehand is really important. So our basis is to prevent and plan by preparing how to prepare, how to respond, and how to recover. So points in here, knowing your building, really important, and understanding where your vulnerabilities are. Get your teams together and check your operational procedures, making sure your maintenance checks are done, making sure these measures you've put in place, backup pumps, all those things that you will need possibly are working. Do a dry run each year, or, you know, every 2 years, or when there's a pending event that you've actually got them maintained. You don't, you know, if the weather forecasters are saying, you know, we're going to have a really wet summer, don't wait till December to get them serviced or checked and find out they don't work, or worse still, in the flood, that they don't work. Having the dry run with the key personnel. Again, knowing your residents, it's really important. Contact information, building wardens familiar with the people in their buildings. And this is what Beth was talking about with people having a personal emergency preparedness plan. You know, where will you go? What will you do? And that's not necessarily just for people with support needs. it's everybody. You know, what will we do? Do I want to live here if I don't have electricity for, you know, days, or if I have to walk up 6 floors, 6 flights of stairs? I've got young children, I've got a baby, I can't do that with groceries. So there's all those thoughts about that. Preparing. So what can residents do now? Residents in the preparation phase can do all of these things that will really, really help getting the building ready. Every year, do a cull, have a look at your storage cages. They're really not meant to be the archives of your life. It's meant to be just, you know, things that you do put in storage, but you make sure that you need them. Packing belongings into waterproof plastic boxes is great because they actually move well in rainy weather rather than cardboard boxes. Thinking about, you know, where you'll take your car, you know, what have you been asked? And when you remove your things from your cages, the one important key thing I would say to everybody is leave your cage like it was the day the building was handed over. In other words, everything that's in there still has to come out when it's dark and it's wet and it's muddy. So if you don't want those documents or those things anymore, or those box of old clothes, take it up while it's dry and put it in the bin, because it's very difficult to get it out there. That's why you need bobcats and things later, which costs a lot of money to get those things out, instead of just coming through and every cage is empty and you just take the fire hoses and go through and turn it over very quickly. Really important. Don't leave even a scrap of paper down there, because that scrap of paper will come out dirty and muddy at the end. We've got checklists in the pre-preparation, obviously, that the body corporate would go through, you know, for the building, for residents and possessions, you know, what to do and when to do it. And try, as a resident, try and follow those directions. If they're saying 3 days out, we'd like you to start getting your cages ready, moving your belongings up into your apartment, you know, do take that and act on it if you can. If you need help, there's obviously, they'll be coordinating people to help, but hopefully, you know, don't leave it to the last minute, because you may not have the lifts. Energex may cut the power. It's much easier to move boxes and things when you have lifts working. Once the power goes off, and the power will be turned off, or even if the power is not turned off, the lifts should be locked off, because you don't want to damage your lifts by leaving them in the basement. So if you're bringing them to the basement and it's, you know, pending floodwaters, you don't want them stuck there. So the body corporate committee will make a decision about a time frame in advance to ensure they're not stuck, that Energex turns the power off before they've had a chance to get the lifts out of the wells. So take note and get your stuff up sooner rather than later. During the response phase, really important is the communications, checking in on people. This security is really important. If you've got lots of big equipment and big things that have come out of people's cages that won't fit in their apartments, you may have to decide on where can we safely put, well, where can we move them to for a start? They're just too big to get into lifts and apartments. And what we did at Flow was we had our visitor car park on ground level, and we moved a lot of things to there, big, you know, wine fridges out of people's car parks, get storage cages, and we've got river homes with big garages, big stuff. But what we also learned is that it can also be a very opportunistic time for other people, and they, you know, you're not going to have power to keep your security running. So we set up a roster for the residents and did from basically, you know, when it got dark, 8 o'clock at night till 6 o'clock in the morning, when people weren't moving around as much, we set up and they all put their name on a roster, and everyone came out for an hour. We made sure, obviously, no children were there, and no time were two females on roster, but that they took an hour a turn, and everybody did so well. They came out, we had floodlights set up with our generator, and they just were sitting there, and they said, we couldn't believe the amount of people who just drove up and down the street checking it out, because we had all these people's belongings there, but they weren't secure. So we did our own security. You might need to have an outside security agency, something like that, that you need to make sure you do secure people's belongings, because the last thing is you want to save it and then get it stolen. So really important thing to think about. Rubbish management. How are you going to, you can't put your rubbish down the chute. you've got to block off your chutes. People will have to walk down where you're going to have those bins out of the basement for people to put rubbish. Recovery. So this is a timeline that a lot of people think, oh, the flood's over, it's finished. We can get back in the basement. I want to put my car away. Well, there's a process. And this is the thing you have to think about, communicating this to people. How long does it take to dewater the basement? It can take a week, depending on how big your basement is, or, what equipment you have, how big is the equipment you've been able to get to do that. Coordinating volunteers and their understanding the process, what they need to do. Things about how you're going to access without power, the use of the facilities. If it's really hot weather, people do want to go and hop in the pool, but you don't have power to run the cleaning. So you need to sort of decide about access for those sort of facilities. And I think the other thing was that people needed to understand that just because we've hosed out the basement doesn't mean it's ready for you to bring your car back in, because it might just be that we've got to get other things through that. And there's a very good timeline about making sure you do this in an orderly process. We've got some checklists there, because people want to jump in and start helping and cleaning up, and they say, I've done my cage, I've done that. But the people 5 cages higher than them or further up the driveway haven't. So mud needs to move and water, and we had people being upset because mud and water was passing through their clean garage, their clean storage cage. So there is a process of doing it in an orderly fashion so that, it's not done twice and 3-4 times over. So this is the checklist that one of our residents, and who's very experienced in this, has written up that we did, and talked about, how you do them and what's expected of that process, so that people understand how to do it properly. In the plan, we've also got a heap of appendices that actually are quite important documents, but probably one of the things we put in there is some signage templates for you, pre-prepared templates, which you can use. Just put your details on them, have them ready to put against, that these bin chutes are out of, not to be used, or, this area is out of use at this time. Having your equipment asset register and knowing where your flood equipment, cleanup equipment is, your brooms, your mops, all of those things is really important. There's no point having all of this equipment and then forgetting that it's in the basement, which is then covered in mud, so you can't use it. We've also set up emergency boxes. These are one for every building, and in there's lots of like high-vis protective covers, gloves, headlamps, we put batteries in at the time that we needed them. So we've done a list and for what we believe is good to have in these emergency boxes, and they're kept, under storage, in safe storage, and these would be lifted out and brought up, in the time when each building would be getting prepared. Don't leave them down in the basement. They'll be covered in water. This resident card is something that we came up with that we thought would be really good to be proactive in. We've done it. It's got 2 sides. I'll quickly go forward to the other side. It's got information on both sides, but it's about letting every single apartment has had a copy of this. It's printed and laminated, put in there, and then it's good for residents on that checklist. Do you have this card? Do you know where it is? And if you need another one, come and ask the building manager, because it's just getting people in that space that they understand, what can I do? Well, in the preparation stage, clearly think about these things. What can I do to help prepare? What's my expectations when we're responding? What do I need to do as a resident? And then in the recovery process, what can I do? So this, I think, is really good because, like we said, lots of people are moving in and out, and lots of people weren't here in between this flood and next flood. They've never lived through a flood. They may have no comprehension or no understanding about what the expectation is. So I think this just gets them thinking about it, and they understand when these, messages start coming out, oh, I understand what I need to do, and they can be prepared a bit earlier. And they're ready mentally to cope with it as well, because they know you're going to ask as a body corporate committee for them to do these things. And just on the back side of that card, we thought it was great to put this information there, PSET planning, that they can go and do those and have a look at what questions, to get myself organised, websites, and, what should I pack in an emergency kit? Sometimes we all think we've got it, and then we get there and we don't have it. So it's and we put our details on the back as well, like some of the, the personal details for our, obviously, complex, with, as long as there's some, general numbers here, but you could add certain ones on here for people as well that might need them. And just checking every year that do you have this card in your apartment somewhere? Hopefully you do. If you need another one, just ask for it. So the tips that I would say for bodies corporates, committees and managers is to stay current. Don't just write this plan, set and forget and go, yes, we've got it. It's all nicely bound and we'll put it on the shelf. Because, as we know, committees are volunteers, and they change. So I would always, talk about like reviewing it annually or as you need it. Think about it after, we have one at Flow. A lot of it, though, we've reviewed and we're taking further steps to improve it. Second time around, you learn things again. And think about what you can do for the future to make your building more resilient. Can you take some funds to put, some measures in place to protect your lifts? They're the most expensive resources. And take ownership. So get prepared early. Maybe have an annual, the funniest thing I think is the council's pick up time, curbside collection time for this area is in March, which is kind of a bit after the fact. If we had ours in October, it would be a good opportunity for people to clear out and get themselves organised before the wet season, because we flood. Probably if we could swap with Mount Cootha's times might be a good idea for the council to swap us over the curbside collection. But if that's the case, maybe you just have to arrange a rubbish collection or a community, rubbish collection that's privately paid for. It's a very good investment as a body corporate to pay to have that done in about October, November. Amazing what people will actually put there, which is stuff that's just not going to end up in that big pile on the street. Again, check your emergency box is complete, reinstate if you've used things before. And the most important thing, I think, at the end is to make sure that you transfer your knowledge. As committees change, as building managers change, make sure that they're aware of the plan, make sure that they understand it, that they're inducted into the plan to understand what's important about it. Because if it's 10 years between a flood and the previous committee are no longer there, the previous building manager who lived through it is no longer there, you're going to go right back through the same thing, because this document is sitting on a shelf somewhere and you never knew it existed as the new committee or the new building manager. Or so keep making sure that you've transferred this knowledge. I think that's part of what you should do as due diligence when a new committee comes in, to make sure that that knowledge is always current. And again, checking the resident cards, that everybody's aware that that information is there for them. So just to finish, and I am on time, 1 minute. Gosh, Paula, you must be proud of me. So I just thought this is something I'd like to share, and I know you can all probably read faster than I can speak, but I'll read it again as well. And so this is from the Dalai Lama's book, The Art of Happiness. The importance of urgency not only applies to overcoming problems on a personal level, but on a community and global level as well. So he spoke to Howard Cutler when he was interviewing him, and he said, when I was in St. Louis, for instance, I met the governor. There they'd recently had severe flooding. The governor told me that when the flood first happened, he was quite concerned given the individualistic nature of society. People might not be so cooperative, that they might not commit themselves to this concerted and cooperative effort. But when the crisis happened, he was amazed by the response of people. They were so cooperative and so committed to the concerted effort in dealing with the flood problems that he was very impressed. So the Dalai Lama says, so to my mind, this shows that in order to accomplish important goals, We need an appreciation of the sense of urgency. Like in this case, the crisis was so urgent that people instinctively joined forces and responded to the crisis. However, unfortunately, he said sadly, often we don't have that sense of urgency. And my takeaway from this, and everybody's got their own takeaway, I hope, but I think we have a wonderful community. We know everybody responds and they get in and they help. What would be better though is if we don't have to have, that as the crisis to get us to act and start being prepared. Let's make this a priority without having to be an urgency. Let's make sure that we think about how we can better prepare our community to be more resilient and come through the next event far more prepared and far happier at the outcome. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Leanne. That's such a good quote to land it on. Yeah, it's the difference between, I think we've spoken about this, it being like a cultural issue in our society, to be quite, individual in our ways of living and the way we protect our property and our storage cages. And I've done my bit, but that person down there hasn't done their bit. And unfortunately, floods really reveal the problems in that way of thinking. And it does take a real collective response. That's definitely something that we think a lot about at Resilient Kurilpa and why we exist. Resilient Kurilpa is a network of people, and as Dr. Beth has pointed out, the strength of that network and the social connectedness between people is actually the thing that boosts resilience to climate disasters. So I think it's really important to make note of that. We have entered the Q&A portion of our evening. There's a few questions here in the Q&A, so I encourage everyone to get their questions in. Beth, there's one here for you to kick off. I'm just going to try and spotlight us a little bit so everyone can see. Beth, so from a disability advocacy point of view, is there anything in particular that you'd like to see happen in flood-prone apartments to support people better?
Yeah, I think it's probably hopefully going to come out from, I guess, the work that you're doing and that Leanne's talking about in terms of preparation. So I think one of the things that's sometimes difficult when you're someone who needs a bit more support is that you often are the one who always has to raise issues and ask for help and do the planning yourself. So I think if there was, some kind of, which I think there is really starting to be now, some kind of recognition in the planning process for everybody, that looking out for people and offering help and thinking about how we can offer support to people who need it was part of the preparation, then it's kind of, I guess it decreases a little bit of anxiety around the fact that you will be able to access some support, and people might put some things in place to make sure that they can help out if you need it. So I think it's raising awareness like this is the first step, and then having it part of the preparation so people are aware.
Yeah. Just on that, I know that when you spoke earlier, you spoke about having a really good support network in your neighbours and whatnot. And, I imagine being isolated in an apartment, and certainly some of the stories we've collected in our library speak to the toll that can have on people's mental health. So I want to know how would you support people in your building who might be having a negative experience with those feelings of isolation or even just uncertainty, because you spoke about how you were kind of right on the edge of losing power for your wheelchair. There must have been fairly negative experiences around the uncertainty that comes with that.
Yeah, and I think because of that support network I had, it's the checking in that helps. So I kind of knew that even if worst case scenario, my phone went dead and my chair went dead, I would have people who would have just come up and like come into the apartment to check on me. So I kind of knew, because of people checking in every day, that if the worst thing had happened and I couldn't reach out, that people were going to proactively check in. So I think checking in is really important. So just knowing that that's going to be a regular thing, and that you can expect it. And yeah, I think that helps with your mental health, but it also means that you're less likely to be in a risky situation where you're really stuck.
Yeah, and I'd imagine doing so, like as Leanne's shown in her procedures, sort of, regulating it in like a management framework that this is what we do, we just do check-ins, will help catch people who, might not be displaying visible signs of disability or illness, or, you might have someone who's pregnant and hasn't asked for help yet or doesn't speak English as their first language. I'd imagine that you'd be able to capture more support needs in that way, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. And also maybe as part of, like Leanne was talking about, the lifts, getting turned off, which I understand they have to, but making sure in apartment buildings that that's communicated to people, because then that's the end of your option to get out. So it's like, okay, this is when we're going to turn off the lift. So if you want to get out, you've got to get out before that. And I mean, that happened for me, that they told me what was going to happen. But if that hadn't happened and you didn't know that the lift was out, then that can cause more anxiety and worry, I think.
Yeah. Leanne, in your experience, just on that note of turning the lifts off and communicating that to residents, how did you go about doing that? Or if you had the time to do that? I don't even know if you did, or because they turned it off in the last flood really quickly, didn't they?
Yeah, so two separate scenarios. At Flow Apartments, so we knew we had turned our lifts off, we'd cleared our basements and turned our lifts off. The reason, it's getting your stuff upstairs in a lift's easier than walking up the stairs with your boxes, is we turned our lifts off and locked them at 4 p.m. on the Sunday. So we told residents that we were doing that. We were clear, we'd done it all, ready to go. River Point, on the other hand, didn't get told at all, where Energex turned the power off. So the lifts, there was no lead up. And that happened at, I think, 9 a.m. on the Sunday. So that was, there was no time for them to get us up. In a lot of those buildings, there were still 2 buildings that had power. So those people were able to still use the lifts. But at a certain point, as I said, you need to turn them off, because if there's going to be water coming into those lift wells, you don't want your equipment to be submerged. And unfortunately, the lifts were homed to the basement. So even though we got them up, we couldn't lock them off in River Point. We couldn't lock them off because the building manager couldn't get to site, because he couldn't get into the area. So they homed back to the basement into the floodwaters. So it's you just need to communicate that if you have the time. That's why I was talking about making sure you take the days before to make sure you utilize that effectively, because Energex may make the decision or just not tell you, and it goes off. You may be halfway through doing something. You may not know. You may not get the opportunity. It's about being prepared in those days before to ensure that you might just get it sprung on you.
Mary in the comments has said, big thanks. It's such a wealth of people planning that you have formulated. She has a question here. How can continuous communication be organised between all the people with responsibilities and roles? Leanne, can you?
Yes, so I think this is where the Body Corporate Committee has to take the ownership and move this forward, because they're the people who are responsible. I mean, they can use subcommittees to develop this plan, but this is what I was talking about, that you have to have the overall leadership with your people, working together, communication with the building manager, communication with the residents, communication with, the building wardens, relaying this information out. And during the year, you need to actually get, maybe have maybe 2 meetings just to make sure everybody's up to speed, and making sure that you're across your plan, so that you know, and when you change, when those roles change, when those positions are filled by a new person, that they're inducted through this plan as well. Don't just wait for the event to say, here, you can be the site coordinator, or here, you can be a building warden. It's you can't just do it at the time. So maybe you have 2 meetings a year that just make sure everybody's up to speed, or maybe just 1 meeting a year. If we're in the El Nino, you've got a bit of time on your side. If we're coming into La Nina, well, you may be needing to be together more frequently to make sure you're across that communication and that people are all on the same page.
Yeah. On the communication point, Beth, there's a question here. What's a respectful way to ask someone with support needs if they need help during a flood?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that often, not everybody, but some people are a bit unsure about how to approach people with disability or health needs to ask questions about if they need assistance, because you don't want to assume that someone needs help. But I think it's just the same way that you would talk to anybody, who you thought was struggling with their grocery bags on the way home or whatever, just to say, hey, I was thinking the other day about if there was a flood, is there anything that I could do to help you if that happened? And I think most people would find that quite a nice way to be asked. So I think it's just about treating people with disability and health needs like you would anyone else, and just asking in a respectful way. And if someone is lucky enough to have it all sorted and be super prepared, unlike me, and doesn't need any help, then they can just say, oh no, I'm fine. But for me, I'd be like, oh yes, do you have this? Or it would be helpful if you could do this or that. So I think it's just about asking respectfully.
Yeah, that's great advice. There's a couple more questions that have come through. Leanne, can you answer this one? What is the role of a building manager in disaster preparation or management?
Okay, so the building manager obviously is a key person in that diagram that I was showing before, for the workings of the building and for obviously the residents with the contact emergency lists and things like that they would provide to that communications officer. They're not the person who just does everything. That they are only 1 or 2 people. They're the person who will, know parts of your building very well and be working with people more along those lines, like getting, making sure where your pumps and things like that are working, and where electrical boards and things like that, to work with those. On the other side, they also, are the person who usually knows a lot of the residents as well. So if they're on site, that's great, but if they may not be there. So the building manager is not someone you would rely on to start the process of preparation. They may or may not be on site. So that's what we were talking about, that the body corporate committee needs to have this group of people, and the building manager is an integral person who works with them. They don't work alone or separate to do things. It's all part of this group together that works along the same plan. But you may not have a building manager on site. Your building may not even, they might be offered a different one. They may not be able to get there. You have to rely that they may not be there at the time. So they're important, of course, but they're not the person who is responsible to lead that preparation.
That's right, yeah. Adrian has made a comment here saying, in 2011, we moved vehicles for owners who were absent or overseas to the streets around. The hardest part was remembering where we parked them. In 2022, the increased number of residents made the identification of alternative parking options really difficult. As the area continues to expand, the advice to residents that they may have to move their vehicles much, much further than a few streets away. In 2022, this was a source of great unrest for many residents who were car dependent or had no alternative. communication of not only the action required, but the difficulty one might encounter is in that action is important. That's a really good comment to make. It's not just these tasks that we have to deliver as instructions to residents, but the realities of what doing that is going to look like for people who have mobility issues, or as they say, are dependent on car, can't walk far, for example, may need to access their car late at night. That provides a new set of challenges. Leanne, did you encounter this issue in the last flood?
Yes. A lot of people who, as I said, who hadn't been here before, they weren't aware of where do I park my car so it is out of that zone. Where is the zone? And, luckily, a lot of people, we found out that, the Woolworths on Ferry Road, the Woolworths parking, underground parking was safe. But, we were saying to people, get it onto the other side of Montague, higher up than Montague Road, because we knew about 2011's levels. But again, people who had to leave to go, yes, people still had to work, but then they've got to get to their cars or things like that. It is really tricky. The sooner you do it, the closer you'll get a car. I guess that's the key. Be one of the first people and you get the closer parks, because if you leave it right to the end to get your cars out, you might find you can't get through. Your basement may not be flooded at that point, but the road's out maybe. So that's all part of that communication. If you're getting told to start moving your cars, it's for a reason. The streets are starting to the opportunities to move are closing, or how far away you need to get. It's a tricky one. It is a really
tricky one, because we know that, our suburbs are becoming denser. Space for car parks is actually being pulled away for some apartment developments. They're creating less parking for people. So I think, for me, I think this one kind of speaks a little bit to the importance of personal emergency planning. This is why it applies to everyone. If you go through an emergency planning process just for yourself, you will need to ask yourself those questions around transport. That's a need. So if the same thing happens again in next year, in 5 years' time during a flood, what's the backup plan for your transport needs? During that time where the buses were still running, I know the ferries were cut for a while, but was the bus network still on time? Can you guys remember?
I don't think I left. I didn't use the buses, but I didn't leave I don't think I left the immediate 2 streets for about 2 weeks, but but doing things. But I couldn't speak to that, but I knew they were still running because Montague Road was clear. So but you maybe have to walk through streets that are flooded to get to the bus too. Just, again, it may not be as simple for a few days till that water goes down in the lower streets. Can be a bit tricky.
Yes. Melinda's just said the buses stopped, as did taxis and Ubers. Yes, so backup plan, work from home, I guess. These questions are bigger than what we can answer, aren't they?
Yeah. And some people who also just working from home and those things that Beth was talking about, some people got, small generators. Obviously, if they're going to, that's fine. You've got to be respectful that you don't want to necessarily run it all night, maybe run it during the day hours to do those, but also where you put them. People think, I'll get a generator, but, it needs to go outside, needs to have ventilation. We saw people who were also using pumps and things in basements that they knew they needed to pump water out, but they didn't think about the gases and the carbon monoxide and things like that. Those gases that are fatal, using those things as well. So it's all well and good to understand I'm going to use a generator to get my supply of electricity. Doesn't mean that it's, you've got to understand how to use it, where to put it. Make sure you're respectful of your neighbours. If you're only running it to watch TV at midnight, it's not fair. But if you're doing it to power your things during the day and you turn it off at 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night, then that's fair enough. And maybe you can share that with leads to other people to help them as well. But different people with different needs will also think about that as something in their personal plan.
Yeah. There's another question here. I wonder, Beth, if you might answer this one. It says it's hard to know how long the power and the lifts will be out for in a flood. How do I decide whether to evacuate or stay and weigh up the risks?
Yeah, I think that's a hard one. I think it's kind of like there is no good answer for that. Because like it says in the question, if you don't know, it looks very different if you're going to be stuck for a week or if you're going to be stuck for 3 weeks. So I think, but then not everyone has the ability to go somewhere else or has somewhere else to go to. So I guess I'm not really sure what the good answer to that one is. I think I made the right choice in 2022, but I also made the right choice to leave in 2011. So both choices were right because of the situations were quite different. I think though, like Leanne said, and I think you said, Paula, as well, obviously if you get asked to leave, I think, should follow the directions and leave if that's what you're being advised to do. But then you have to have somewhere to go. So that's pretty complicated.
Melinda's just added a comment here. There was a resident in an apartment at Toowong who put a generator in the hall, and the next door neighbour was on a ventilator and the fumes went into their apartment and they had to be medically relocated due to this. Oh dear. Yes, that's
scary.
That's really scary. Big warning around generators.
Yeah, they need to be in open spaces. I think the one thing that was actually, and it's just something that might be considered for, depending on the apartment that you live in or as a body corporate, the size of the complex. But at Flow, we were lucky enough to be able, we had contacts to we had a refrigerated trailer. And because we had a generator as well, a big generator, we bought that there. That ran our pumps, our submersible pumps to help pump. It also ran a power charging station, and it also ran a refrigerated trailer, which you can hire those. You don't have to own one. You can hire them. Getting these in advance is something that they'll go quickly, from your local Kennard store. But what it did was, now there's 81 apartments in Flow, and we managed to be able to, people could get things out of their fridge and bring them down so they didn't have food spoilage. Might have had a few things go, but they could go to Woolworths and bring back groceries. And we just said it's an honesty system, put in a bag, put your unit number on it. And it was a walk-in sort of refrigerator trailer, but everybody could still live and eat and work because they have that access to keeping perishables, on site. They actually were able to do that. That's something you can consider in your flood plan. Should we think about hiring, what size generator or what else can we hire, which will help people stay on site longer and more comfortable and mitigate those losses as well. Because, you're all down there working really hard. If you've got no food and you've got to walk up and get takeaways, it becomes pretty expensive all the time. So that's just another thought, for bodies corporates when they're thinking about what they can do to assist residents.
That's a good tip.
Yeah, generators are good if they're used properly though. But
yes, big safety warning around that. Big safety warning. So there's another question here. Who's responsible for getting resident details and keeping the information updated? And how do we get all residents' information, including those who rent? How have you guys gone about it, Leanne?
So again, the building manager using that residents' contact form when there's people moving in, whether they be owners or, tenants. Everybody comes in and provides that, and just maybe just putting it out there and say, do you need to update these details? But it really has to be, from a privacy point of view, it really does need to be that list collated by your building manager, and they need to keep it in electronic format. We don't want people putting it out there on pieces of paper in an event. The communications officer has to have that as an electronic version, and they're the only person who has it for privacy reasons. And, you know, and it really comes down to the building manager is the person who has the best position to keep that updated. And I really do think that's a challenge. And I know that there's a lot of people say, I just can't do it. Our complex is too big. It can be done with it's tricky, it's hard, but if you start, you'll get it, and it will be easy to maintain there, because people, and if you educate or tell people why you're doing it, they'll be more forthcoming with the information, and they'll come and tell you, oh, I need to update my information, or I'm going to be away. You know, they'll communicate better with people and say, I'll be overseas for 3 months, but hey, guess what? You know, these are my details, and you know, I've left a spare set of keys with one of the neighbours, or I've left my keys to my car on my bench top in the kitchen, and I've given permission to the manager to allow access for them to move my vehicle if needed in the time I'm away. That's really good that you give people this information, because and the building manager is the right person to do that. You can't give it to 15 people. You've got to give it to one source.
Yes, that kind of relates to a question here. I'm just conscious of time. We've got 4 more minutes, but I want to try and get through some of these questions. What should people do if they're going away for a long period of time during the flood season, and they have cars and stuff in their storage cage? Does that come into that resident information, Leanne?
Yeah, and just talking to your neighbours or the building, if you've got a building warden, like if you've got a couple of towers or a couple of buildings, you know, just going to them, you know, that they know. You know, we talk amongst ourselves as residents and say, hey, I'm going to be heading away for a couple. Make sure if you see a moving truck out in my garage, I'm not moving. You know, someone's stealing stuff. Just these things that, you know, my garage door is open, I'm away. If you for a long period of time, you know, like a couple of months, it's good just to look out for each other. But if you're prepared, run your fridge down. Do not leave perishables in your fridge or freezer. The worst thing is having to clean someone's freezer out because the power's gone off and you've found out 3 days later that all their meat stinks. So do that before you leave. Be a little bit more prepared. You know, just make sure that your stuff is pretty much, you know, ready if someone else has to move it for you. I was talking about those plastic boxes instead of cardboard boxes. Clean out the junk you don't need, because guess what? They're going to be coming up and putting those things. It's got to go somewhere safe. It'll go up into your apartment. So if they're trying to move these things out of your storage cage, they're going to put them in your apartment. And I think this is what people just have to understand. They're doing it for the best thing. You don't want it to end up on the street going to the landfill to the tip with a bobcat. You know, they'd rather be in your apartment and be safe, stacked up in your apartment, than out on the street. So, yeah, get organised a little bit beforehand and make sure that people know you're away, and that, you know, where things are for them to make it easier to help evacuate your belongings.
There's just one more question here before we wrap up. If someone wants to create a personal emergency plan, how can they get started on that? Leanne, the resources that are certainly in the flood mitigation plan and we have available on our website in the apartment toolkit come from the University of Sydney. It's a workbook and a process called Person-Centered Emergency Preparedness, or PSEP for short. And it's a process that's been co-designed with people with disability around taking steps similar to what we're trying to do with the apartment flood mitigation plan, taking, you know, manageable steps that question what your support needs are, what your strengths are, who your support network is, and how to communicate your plan to your support network, which will include people in your apartment building, you know, your building manager and whatnot, your residents, your neighbours. So that PSEP, those PSEP resources are available on Resilient Kurilpa's apartment toolkit. However, we're also running PSEP workshops in October for free. And so if any building managers or apartment residents out there have no residents in their apartment buildings that have disability or mobility needs, or might be interested in developing a personal emergency plan, please do get in contact with us so that you can join us and we can support you to do that process. Similar to apartment, flood planning, it is a process. It takes time. That's one more question I did want to ask you, Leanne, actually, was just really quickly, how long did it take you and your body corporate and your residents to formulate your flood mitigation plan?
Oh, we did one in flow after 2011, which did take a bit of work, but then we used that as the base to start the River Point one, and that's been an ongoing document for 6 to 10 months, especially, we split it, we divided with, the building, the technical stuff, and then the residents side stuff. And it's improving all the time, but it took a long time, and that's why I was saying it was overwhelming. So this is why we'd rather people give them the template and say, here, the grunt work's done, and you just need to think of, that's the hardest bit, is knowing what you need to put in the plan. So hopefully we've given them a good base to start with that plan.
Yeah, it's a good point to finish on. Even though, apartment flood planning and personal emergency planning are both big processes, there are resources out there that make it more manageable for people to undertake. And that's why Resilient Kurilpa exists. So I just want to now thank Leanne and Dr. Beth for joining us tonight. It's sort of the voluntary contributions that you guys make, not just tonight, but in lead up to this event, and all of the work that Resilient Kurilpa has done and the conversations we've had to even get to this stage in the first place, that is so valued. So I really appreciate you joining us. I want to say thanks to all the attendees tonight. Even though we might only reach 20, 40 people tonight, we know that a lot of you sit in these influential positions at, in your body corporate committees that can have actually a massive impact for 500 plus residents, depending on how your flood mitigation planning goes. So we know that impact ripples out through body corporate. So if you do know other body corporate members or any neighbours in your community or other floodplains, people in Kangaroo Point, for example, I know are interested in this sort of work, please do share our website and our resources and this recording with them so that we can build a more sort of wider flood resilience. We do have a couple more events coming up. So on our website, you'll find we are doing a practical guide to flood insurance for apartments. We were going to maybe touch on some flood insurance stuff tonight, but it's such a can of worms. It's a huge topic, and we're going to really unpack it in this next webinar. So that one's on the 11th of July at 6 p.m. Leanne's going to be joining us again. We have already some really good insights from Leanne and Adrian around flood insurance on our website. And on our YouTube. So in the meantime, please do check those out. We're also going to be doing psychological first aid training for flood volunteers. So as we know, people in apartments find themselves in these volunteer positions, contributing to all the cleanup work, supporting and checking in with people's welfare. And that can, we can land ourselves in sort of these precarious positions where we're having to support people's mental health and we might not feel prepared to do that. So this webinar, which is going to be run with the amazing team at Metro South, is going to focus on preparing us as a community to do that psychological first aid work, and just get better at caring for ourselves and each other during a flood disaster or any other kind of disaster, really. The last thing is we have a flood survey out. We'd really appreciate people filling this out and sending it to anyone else they know that live in the flood zone in Kurilpa, or anywhere else really in Brisbane. I'm just going to put the link to that in the chat here. Really appreciate collecting some data around that. That gives us an idea of how prepared we're feeling, what your concerns are, and what help you'd like in terms of building your flood resilience. Okay, I think that's it from me. Thanks again to Beth and Leanne. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you at our next webinar.
Thank you.